When Una Caro was released, many Catholics around the world felt a momentary peace. It seemed, at last, that Rome had spoken with clarity, uncomplicated, recognizable, anchored in tradition. A document on marriage, simple and firm, untouched by the restless winds of modern ambiguity. For a moment, there was relief. Theologians, priests, and ordinary believers felt something akin to trust awakening again. The Church, they thought, had found its voice amid the noise. A voice that remembered the sacredness of vows, the holy weight of, "till death do us part." People began to say that perhaps, after years of uncertainty, the Church was remembering who she was. It was not about innovation or adaptation. It was about fidelity. It was about truth. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. Beneath that breath of relief, some sensed a tremor. It was not dramatic. There were no headlines screaming disruption. No public clashes. Instead, it was something quieter, almost elegant, a subtle unease that rested not in what the document proclaimed, but in how it proclaimed it. The surface was beautiful, reverent even. Words like fidelity, unity, sacrament, grace. Powerful words. Words that had built centuries of Catholic teaching. But if one listened closely, not to the words, but to the spaces between the words, something felt different. Those accustomed to reading the rhythm of Vatican documents noticed it first. A certain softness. A tone that did not sound like conviction, but like consultation. Some passages seemed less like teaching and more like scaffolding, temporary structures, designed to hold a place for something else to arrive later. It wasn't what Una Caro said, it was what it left unsaid. The missing weight. The missing finality. The suggestion that what was solid might soon be flexible. What looked definitive might eventually be adaptable. In a time when the world was loudly redefining marriage, family, motherhood, fatherhood, and even identity itself, many had hoped for clarity. In a time when confusion had become a kind of cultural currency, many hoped the Church would stand like a lighthouse, clear, firm, radiant. But instead, some began to feel like the lighthouse had become a stage. A stage waiting for new voices, new interpretations, new actors. And then came the moment that left many speechless. At the official presentation of Una Caro, before even touching the heart of the topic, before honoring the sacred dignity of matrimony, Cardinal Fernández opened with a joke. A light, awkward, unsettling joke about Romans, their wives, their women, and even their men. The room fell silent. Not angry. Not loud. Just silent, heavy, uneasy, embarrassed. It wasn't merely inappropriate. It felt symbolic. Because in a moment meant to elevate the sacrament of marriage, the tone became casual. Playful. Indulgent. Almost mocking. It was not the content of the joke that unnerved people, it was what it represented. A signal that something sacred was no longer being spoken about in sacred tones. Marriage, once described with reverence, was now being treated almost conversationally. It was subtle, yes. But subtle shifts are the most dangerous. They don't rewrite doctrine. They rewrite atmosphere. An atmosphere changes everything. People noticed. Some described it as a slip. Others as a symptom. But for many, it felt prophetic, an expression of how lightly the sacred is now treated. A theologian wrote anonymously the next day, "Mockery does not begin as contradiction. It begins as levity." The question was no longer whether the Church still believed in marriage as covenant, it clearly did. The question was whether the language of covenant had begun to soften. whether the sacred had begun to sound negotiable. Yet the document itself was not an attack on doctrine. On paper, it defended monogamy, fidelity, and sacrament. It affirmed Catholic teaching. But it also quietly opened windows through which future interpretations could enter. It did not defy tradition, it gently loosened it. The text stood firmly with doctrine, but in ways that could easily bend. A document reassuring today, but architected for tomorrow. Some theologians began calling it a Trojan horse, but written in elegant Latin. Another said, it is not a wall, it is a door, disguised as a wall. The real concern was not whether Una Caro defended marriage today, it did. The question was, would it defend it tomorrow? And how much could its carefully structured language be used differently later? One Vatican observer said something chilling, I don't fear what this document says. I fear what it prepares. And then came the most delicate, and perhaps most telling section of all, the discussion of Africa, and specifically, the Church's approach to polygamy. Here, the tone changed dramatically. Instead of reaffirming Catholic doctrine with clarity, it adopted something softer. Terms like dialogue, graduality, accompaniment, pastoral flexibility began to dominate the page. Words that sounded compassionate. Words that sounded open. Words that sounded negotiable. It did not approve of polygamy, no. But it did not outright reject it either. It did not condemn it as incompatible with sacrament, it merely called it pastorally complex. It shifted from definition to discussion. From proclamation to perspective. From clarity to conversation. Beautiful words. But dangerous when used to replace truth rather than express it. And that, for some, was when the tremor turned into a warning. Some remembered Fatima. Some remembered Akita. Some remembered the warnings, the final battle will be about marriage and the family. That line, repeated often over the decades, felt less like prophecy and more like commentary. Because this debate was no longer about polygamy in Africa, or jokes at press conferences, or pastoral vocabulary. This was something deeper. Something that reached into the Marian identity of the Church. Something that touched how the Church sees herself. Bride. Mother. Faithful. Consecrated. Undivided. The Church has always understood marriage not merely as human institution, but as divine reflection. Marriage as covenant. Covenant as consecration. Consecration as fidelity. Fidelity as indivisible. And at the heart of that mystery stands Mary. Virgin, Mother, Bride. The undivided heart. The Immaculate Heart. The total yes. The complete consecration. Mary is not simply a model of purity, she is the embodiment of single-hearted fidelity. She is the icon of what it means to belong wholly to God, with no division, no ambiguity, no graduality. She is the one place where modern elasticity cannot exist. There is nothing elastic about the fiat. It is not evolving. It is not conditional. It is not contextual. It is total. And that is why some began to whisper that the shift now unfolding is not only doctrinal, it is Marian. Not a rejection of Mary. Not a denial of her role. But something more subtle, a softening of her uniqueness. A reinterpretation of her symbolism. A gentle reframing of virginity, consecration, fidelity, and spiritual femininity, not through defiance, but through redescription. And so, the question emerged quietly but clearly, if marriage becomes flexible, does Mary eventually become symbolic? If covenant becomes contextual, does consecration become metaphorical? If the language of fidelity changes, does the language of Marian identity change with it? Some theologians began to notice new language emerging in Vatican texts. Less emphasis on Mary's total consecration, more emphasis on her journey of faith. Less on her immaculate vocation, more on her human discernment. Not false, but softer. Not wrong, but different. Not heretical, but incomplete. A language that sounds rich, but lacks weight. And the shift did not stop there. Some liturgists began suggesting that Marian devotion must become more relatable, more inclusive, less absolutist, more accessible to a modern mindset. Others began promoting the idea that Mary should be seen more as companion than as queen. More as sister than as mother. Beautiful thoughts, but missing something sacred. Missing something foundational. Missing her singularity. A professor in Rome once said, "When Mary stops being absolute, consecration stops being absolute." And consecration is the heart of everything. Without consecration, marriage becomes arrangement. Priesthood becomes role. Vocation becomes preference. The Eucharist becomes symbol. And in that gentle descent from mystery to metaphor, identity begins to change. Saints through the centuries have repeated the same insight: when devotion to Mary declines, reverence for the Eucharist declines. Because the Eucharist is the perfect expression of totality. Not partial, not gradual, not metaphorical. This is my body. Not interpreted. This is my blood. Not adapted. The Eucharist is the covenant, given entirely. And Mary is the living monstrance of that covenant. That is why some now fear that the Church is slowly moving from a defined identity to a defining identity, from a receiver of truth to a seeker of truth. From Mary's fiat to theology's maybe. Identity itself hangs in the balance. Because this is not only about marriage, or even about Mary. It is about whether the Church continues to speak the language of covenant, or adopts the language of process. A language that may sound more pastoral, more open, more compassionate, but may eventually grow too big, too flexible, to still be Marian. And when that happens, nothing will seem wrong. Nothing will appear broken. Everything will seem peaceful, beautiful, pastoral, adaptable. But something will be missing. Not denied. Just replaced. And that, some say, is the most unsettling shift of all. Is it happening? Not clearly. Not officially. Not conclusively. But many can feel it, something gently unfolding. Doctrine not rejected, but rephrased. Tradition not contradicted, but linguistically softened. Mary not denied, but gradually democratized. Marriage not redefined, but gently redescribed. Consecration not dismissed, but reinterpreted. The sacred not abandoned, but casually introduced. The holy not contradicted, but slowly humanized. Truth rarely disappears. It simply changes tone. What do you think? God bless you.